I have heard of a land on a faraway strand. In the Bible the story is told, where cares never come, never darkness nor gloom, and nothing shall ever grow old. In that year.
All right, so Leviticus 23, it again starts the way that every one of these chapters has started. The Lord spoke again to Moses. Probably more than any book in the Bible, the book of Leviticus is clearly the Word of God. It continually brings before us the fact that these are the very words of God, that God is the one who is doing the speaking. Moses is told that he is to speak to the sons of Israel concerning the appointed times of the Lord. And these appointed times are called in verse 3, my holy convocation. What is a convocation? There's one person in the room who's probably most familiar with the term. They use it for graduation. That is correct. It's what? It is an assembly, a formal, purposeful assembly. That's what the word essentially means. And so that's an important thing. Now, we want to get into verse 3 because that's the first one that's introduced. But I'm going to tell you up front, this one's a challenging one in some ways. It's very different than some of the other things that are talked about in this chapter. Than the Day of Atonements and the feast, or the Day of the Tabernacles and the various other holy days, appointed days that God gives. This is a weekly observance. And I'm just going to go ahead and read the text. For 6 days work may be done, but on the seventh day there is a Sabbath of complete rest, a holy convocation. You shall not do any work. It is a Sabbath to the Lord in all your dwellings. All right, work may be done for 6 days. That's pretty clear. It's not all that complicated to understand that part of it. The seventh day, he then says, is a Sabbath. Okay, so what does the word Sabbath mean? By the way, that is not a native English word. It is kind of a transliterated word brought into our language. What does it mean? Yeah, I don't know what to say other than a rest. And in this case, it is a day of religious observance and is pronounced as a day that you abstain from work, which has become the natural English definition of it. So if you look it up in the English dictionary, it's going to say a religious day of observance where work is abstained from. I'm not sure the original term goes that far, but it is a day of rest. It's the seventh day, is what is significant about it. We talk about it as if it's our Saturday. I don't know if the Hebrew days of the week aligned exactly with our calendar or not, but it was their seventh day. Um, it calls it a holy convocation. Now, we just defined convocation. And what is a convocation? A formal gathering. So when it says it is a Sabbath of complete rest, a holy convocation, that raises some questions. Is this a day that they just didn't do anything? They stayed at home, and that was what God defined as a holy convocation? Or was it a day that they assembled? Now, it is not clear from Exodus. There's no instructions here about the assembly, about where they're to go, about who's to assemble, about what goes on there, or any of that. There's very little anywhere in the Old Testament that defines any of that stuff. But there is a New Testament verse that I want to draw your attention to in connection with this, because what we're going to see is at least how it was practiced by the time of Jesus, and that we can conclude that it must have been acceptable for this to go on. So Luke chapter 4 and verse 16 is the text I have in mind, where it says, "Then he came to Nazareth." Who's he? In this context, it's Jesus. So then Jesus came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up. As usual, he entered the synagogue on the Sabbath day and stood up to read. And the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. And unrolling the scroll, he found the place where it was written. And then there's a quote from Isaiah there. The usual practice of the Lord on the Sabbath day was to do what? To go to the synagogue for an assembly. And particularly an assembly that apparently was all about reading and studying and discussing the scriptures. So they had an assembly on the Sabbath. Whether that was prescribed way back when, because here's the truth of the matter: the synagogues didn't exist back then. Synagogues came along later. Or whether that was just the current way in which they manifested that holy convocation idea, I'm not clear on. The Sabbath is called a holy convocation, so I think that indicates that it wasn't merely a day off from work. It was a day set apart unto God, and God was the focus of it. God was intended to be the focus of it. Whether the term itself requires a formal weekly assembly throughout Israel is much less clear, but by the time of the Lord, it apparently was the customary thing in which happened. Not a massive, all of Israel has to be in Jerusalem together, but that people in their local places assembled for the purposes of remembering God, reading the scriptures, discussing those things. The text clearly establishes the holiness of the day. And like I said, the precise form of the convocation is not described here. Yeah.
First part of verse 3, right, it says it's the holy convocation, and the last part it says it's the Sabbath to the Lord in all your dwelling places.
Right. Now, here's the next question.
Place they have to go to do this.
Right. And I'll even say that word dwelling is interesting to me, because that dwelling could be their personal dwelling, or it could be the city in which they were in, which clearly by Luke 4, it had taken that nature. So I'm not even sure how the word dwelling is used in that sentence. I mean that verse, but that's the situation. What we can discern and what we know from it is that God says, "Listen, every seventh day doesn't belong to you; it belongs to me. 6 days is enough for you. You do your work in 6 days. The seventh day belongs to me." Now, if we go to Exodus, there's some other significance connected to the Sabbath and other reasons why it's given. And all that is, I'm not saying unimportant, but it's not directly connected to this context. But he's again laying down the Levitical law, which is being given to Moses to be taught by the priests about their practices and their responsibilities and what they had to teach the people. And that included this idea that, listen, the seventh day doesn't belong to you. The seventh day belongs to God. It's His. You use it for His purposes. Um, so, it, and again, I don't like all this language. I read it all day, and so it creeps into my brain. Uh, the sacred calendar, the divine days and appointments of things begins not with some annual feast, but with a weekly thing. And I think that's somewhat significant. We need to understand that. It's not, when we think of the holy days of Israel, we think of the Pentecost and the things when they're making their trek into Jerusalem, the Day of Atonement, these days when they're making their way into Jerusalem for these big events. That is not where God starts. God starts with them at home and says, look, every week you have a day that belongs to me. And you think about me and you remember me and you dedicate yourself to me rather than yourself. 6 days is enough for you to worry about your responsibilities. Uh, he moves from that to the Passover. I don't know that I'm comfortable making a huge argument about um, the order that these are given. And I'll be honest with you, I I failed to do something that just now entered my mind as something that may be beneficial to do, and that is to see if they're actually done according to the calendar from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. I don't know the answer to that question. Somebody watching online probably does and will comment and say, well, you really ought to know this. But anyway, um, you can correct me. I'm okay with that. I'm not sure. I'm very uncomfortable saying that one of these days is more important than another. They each had purposes and they were all, I would argue, equally important. Like all of the commandments of God, I don't think it's fair to say, I don't have to worry about that one. That's kind of a cast off. If I have time to do it, I'll do it. I think all of the things that God does has uh, reason and purpose to it, and these days are along that. The Passover clearly is an important event in their history, and it was a shadow of an even more important thing. That he had them remember it, I think is significant because he was preparing them for what he was doing. So the Lord's Passover falls on the 14th day of the first month. That clearly is a calendar thing. The first one they're going to get to in the first month. It begins on the 15th day of the first month. The Feast of Unleavened Bread does. According to verse 6, the unleavened bread is eaten for 7 days. The first day is a holy convocation, so it starts off with an assembly. No laborious work is to be done, so it is in and of itself a type of Sabbath. Offerings by fire are presented for 7 days. The seventh day is a holy convocation, so it ends with an assembly, and no laborious work is to be done on that day. And so this year begins with a remembrance of redemption. Why is it called Passover? Okay, so the 10th plague in Egypt was that the firstborn of all in Egypt were going to die. However, if they killed a lamb, a very specific lamb, and put the blood on their lintels and over their doorpost, then death would pass by that house. And that's where the idea of Passover comes from. That was a shadow of what? Of Christ and us being delivered from death. So he has this continual reminder built into their system. So he does this thing as a shadow of what he is doing through them, by the way. He's bringing the Passover lamb, our Passover lamb, through them. So the work that he's doing with them is to actually accomplish the thing that he begins them with, which is this Passover. And then he builds into their system an annual reminder of that event. If it was done properly, like every other memorial, when it occurred, what should take place? One generation tells the next generation, this is what this means. That was the purpose of it being a memorial. There's that incident where they stacked the stones in the river. What's the purpose of this? Well, so when your children see these stones and they ask, what do these stones mean? You can tell them the story of what happened here. This is the same kind of thing. Do we have any memorials? Yeah. And what should we do? We should talk about the significance of it and what the remembrance is all about. And so we don't forget, because we do forget. And one of the ways that becomes very clear to us in studying the Bible is, how big of an impact did Joseph make in the world? I mean, he made a huge impact in the world. He became the ruler in Egypt, a foreigner, chosen by the emperor to lead the nation. And a generation later, they didn't know who he was. And that's how quickly people can forget. So these things, when he said to observe the Sabbath on the seventh day, how often did they need to observe it? For 6 days your work may be done, but on the seventh day there is a Sabbath and complete rest. Conversation you shall do not away with the Sabbath. It doesn't say anything about every week. As long as it's the seventh day, can they just do it once a month? Could they do it once a year? And the answer is no. When he says the seventh day, he means the seventh day. When he says upon the first day of the week, he means the first day of the week. How often do we have a first day of the week? Well, we have it every week. Okay, how often do we do this? Upon the first day of the week. For what purpose? So we don't forget. So we don't forget what God has done. So we don't forget what God is doing. So we don't forget who we are in our relationship to him. Which is one of the reasons why, for instance, in the Lord's table, not only are we discerning the body and the blood of the Lord, but also we're doing what? We're examining ourselves. It's a constant reminder of who we are, of the price that was paid for us, of how important these relationships are. Same thing with this Pentecost feast, or actually, I don't want to jump ahead. The Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, is also what it might be called. And there's lots of regulations about that. Why is it called the Feast of Unleavened Bread? All right. Now, that is not the only writing in the Bible about this week. There's some preparations that had to be made for this week. That had to be made before the week started. And by the way, I think convocation in this context is just like convocation in the Sabbath context, I don't think it was a wide, giant scale thing. I think it was a smaller thing. And in fact, we have an example of that in the New Testament with Jesus and his disciples who had a holy convocation at the beginning of Passover in an upper room, 13 of them. I say 13. I don't know about the other people that tended to hang around. There was as many as 120 in total. But we know that the 13 were there on that occasion. So anyway, I tend to think that that's the convocation that it's talking about. But they came together and they remembered and focused on what God had done and what God was doing. And then the offering of the first fruits. These instructions apply when Israel enters the land. Of course, that is some time between the Exodus and when they actually entered the land. There's some time that passes there. But this one's going to start once they enter the land, according to verse 10. When you enter the land which I'm going to give you, you know, it's that future language, then you need to do this, because you're gonna plant and you're gonna reap harvests. And this is what I want done when that starts happening. The first sheaf of the harvest is brought to the priest. What is a sheaf? It is a bundle of grain. So you would lay these lengthwise and tie them together. The pictures I've always seen, they stand them back up and the grain heads are hanging over. The field would just be full of sheaths. It is what happens at harvest with the first one. And I think there's some significance in that. The first fruit is always considered the best. I don't really know quality wise if that's always true, but I do know when you've been working for months to get something, that first fruit is really sweet. You're finally getting what you've been working for. And he says, okay, the first one doesn't belong to you. The first one is to be brought to the priest and is to be waved before the Lord for acceptance, verse 11. A male lamb without defect is offered as a burnt offering, verse 12. A grain offering and a drink offering accompany it in verse 13. The people may not eat of the new harvest until this offering is presented. Before you enjoy the fruit of the land, what are you expected to do? What does God tell them they're expected to do? Offer sacrifices of thanksgiving for the harvest that you're receiving. You don't take a bite of this food until you have done this. And notice the language there. It is to be waved before the Lord for acceptance. Who's the source of the fruit of the field? Anybody ever watched the movie Shenandoah? Hadn't quoted from Shenandoah in a long time. And unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to do it verbatim. It's been too long since I watched it. There is a scene in the beginning of that movie. Jimmy Stewart plays the title character. He is a farmer in Virginia. His wife was religious. He not as much. Got a bunch of kids. The wife is dead. He comes in, table is set. They're offering thanks for the food. And he leads the prayer where he goes through this whole long thing and rehearses all of the hard work that they did. You know, we busted up the ground, we got the stones out of the ground, we planted it, we watered it, we cared for it, we harvested it, we brought it in, we cooked it, and we set it on the table, but we thank you still the same anyway. That's how it ends. The whole point of the prayer is we did all the work, but we're going to thank you anyway. And it's said very sarcastically. Now, by the end of the movie, the character changes completely. But what he's trying to get them to do is never get like that. Every harvest they receive, first, remember, it came from God. Everything, every blessing we have is God's. The Feast of Weeks, what do we also know that one as? Pentecost. Also sometimes called by some the Feast of Harvest or the Day of the First Fruits. This is 15 through 22 in the chapter. 7 complete Sabbaths are counted from the day after the Sabbath. That's what happens in verse 15. You shall count for yourselves from the day after the Sabbath, from the day when you brought in the sheaf of the wave offering. So see, that's why it's connected to the day of first fruits. So at that point, 7 complete Sabbaths, and that's a total of 50 days. So he says, you shall count 50 days to the day after the 7th Sabbath. You shall present a new grain. That's why it's called Pentecost, by the way. So 7 complete Sabbaths, 50 days, a new grain offering is presented. 2 loaves baked with leaven are offered as the first fruits. This is very different than the unleavened bread that was connected to the Passover. This was to be leavened bread. Additional sacrifices, verses 18 and 19, are to accompany this: lambs without defect, a bull of the herd, 2 rams. They're to be made as a burnt offering, libations and offering of fire or soothing aroma to the Lord. You shall also offer 1 male goat for a sin offering and 2 male lambs, 1 year old, for a sacrifice of peace offering. So there's all sorts of burnt offerings that are connected to this. Then the priest waves them before the Lord, verse 20. I'm not sure if that's actually physically waving it back and forth or if that expression just means to present it to the Lord, but that's the language that it uses. A holy convocation is proclaimed, no labor is to be done. There's a running theme to all of these days. There's a lot of stuff that's different about them, and then there's this one thing that is consistent. No laborious work is to be done. The people are reminded not to reap the corners of the field, not to gather the gleanings, and to leave provision for the needy and the stranger. There's rules about that. They were, when they harvested their fields, the stuff that was along the roadways, they were not supposed to harvest. The stuff that fell, they weren't to pick up. That was what the poor and the traveler who didn't have any means to feed himself was able to stop and glean the fields to get the food that they needed. Thanksgiving to God is joined with generosity toward others in this holiday. Blessing received from God doesn't stop with me. I got a blessing from God. What should I do with it? Share. And so what is, I mentioned that there's a common factor in all of these feasts so far. What is it? Look at verse 21. You shall do no laborious work. Go back to verse 8. No laborious work is to be done. Go back to verse, what was that, 3. No laborious work is to be done. The Feast of Trumpets is the next one. God's instrument. Again, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the sons of Israel, saying, in the 7th month, on the 1st day of the month, you shall have a rest, a reminder by blowing of trumpets, a holy convocation. You shall not do any laborious work, but you shall present an offering by fire to the Lord. Now, I want to throw something else in here that that I think is worth our consideration. The other thing that's connected to a lot of these days is what? Offerings. Now, it says you shall do no laborious work, but what about the priests? They worked every holiday. That was a busy day for them. That actually comes up in the New Testament when there's a dispute about the Sabbath that arises, and it is raised as a it's you're gonna apply this that the way you're applying it. Does that mean the priests are not allowed to do anything? And that becomes an important point, I think, about all of these days. Were men created for these days? No, God didn't say, okay, look, I got an idea. I'm going to have this 7th-day Sabbath rest, and then I'm going to have this Passover, and there's going to be a big meal, and a lamb's got to be prepared, and we got bitter herbs and all kinds of stuff. Okay, I got that Passover. Oh, well, how about, okay, let's think about the first fruits. Oh, yeah. A day in which we're going to honor the harvest and a day of first fruits, and then after he set down all these things, said, okay, now what can I make to observe these? Let me see. I'll make a man to serve these days. That is not what's going on here. And in fact, we're being told that God is creating days for what purpose? To serve us, to help us, to make us remember what's going on and who we are and what we're doing. So later on again, Jesus actually is challenged, and his response is, was man made for the Sabbath, or was Sabbath made for man? And the answer to that question is, the Sabbath was made for man. Now, there's a lot of lessons that we can take from that, but one of them that I think is extremely valuable for us to take from that is that when God does something, okay, blowing trumpets. Why have them blow trumpets? Other than the fact that trumpets sound better than all other instruments. Why not clarinets? Why not flutes? Why not beat drums? Does it matter? I think there's probably a reason so that it could be heard. Trumpets are loud and obnoxious and can be heard. There's some reason for it, but do we have to know the whys and wherefores in order to get the reminder that he has designed for it? There are some events where trumpets are blown and major events happen. I don't know if this directly connected them or not, but he does say a reminder by blowing of trumpets. It's a reminder of something. The Day of Atonement is the next one talked about, verses 26 through 32, observed on the 10th day of the 7th month. It again is said to be a holy convocation. The people are to humble themselves, verse 27, An offering of fire is to be presented. No work is to be done. Verse 28. Reason given, it's a day of atonement. Listen, if you want to put a significance on one of these days, this is the one to put a significance on. The biggest significance of this book is chapter 16 and the atonement, sacrifice. Anyone refusing to humble himself, it says, is cut off. I'm afraid that there would be a lot of us who would be in a lot of trouble if we had this principle apply. Okay, so the Lord's Day rolls around and we're to have an assembly and we're to remember the Lord's death and we're to humble ourselves, and anyone who does not humble himself is to be cut off. How many of us would be left? Anyone who works is destroyed from among the people, verse 30. It is a Sabbath of complete rest. Now, we've seen that already once this chapter, haven't we? The week Sabbath is also said to be a Sabbath of complete rest. But they did, at least by the time of the Lord, go to the synagogue and read the scriptures together on that day and have that kind of an assembly. So I think complete rest is directed intentionally toward their daily labor, and not if they do something on that day that someone defines as work. But it's a day of remembrance of what was done to atone them, a day in which they should have been humbled. What was done to atone man? Well, that particular sacrifice involved 2 animals. Anybody remember the process? Yeah, 2 goats. One was a scapegoat and one was killed. What did it envision? Well, it envisioned what was accomplished on the cross, that Christ died so that we could live, so that our sins could be carried away from us, and we didn't have to bear the consequences of those things. This was a day to remind them of what he was doing and how fellowship was going to be possible. I have to stop there, unfortunately, so we'll pick up the very end of this chapter, starting in verse 33, and get into chapter 24 next time, I think. We're going to look over. Maybe I did do the work. I said I didn't do the work, but maybe I did. I have a chart here. I have a chart. Maybe I did do the work. So we'll find that out next week too.
I have heard of a land on a faraway strand. In the Bible the story is told, where cares never come, never darkness nor gloom, and nothing shall ever grow old. In that beautiful land on the faraway strand, no storms with their blast ever frown. The street, I am told, is paved with pure gold, and the sun